Welcome to Intelligence Analysis and Ontology Engineering. I'm the guy named here on this first slide. If you recall, in previous lectures, we discussed intelligence analysis from a top-down and bottom-up perspective. Initially, we were looking at things from a high-level perspective, and specifically within the context of basic formal ontology and its methodological convictions, so things such as fallibilism, realism, etc. And then we also looked from the ground up or the bottom up from the perspective of intelligence analysis insofar as it's a cognitive process involved in an intelligence cycle. And today, we're going to shift some of our focus into analyst practices in the real world, and we'll be starting with military intelligence, which is just one form of intelligence we'll be discussing, but not the worst place to start. So with that, before we get into those weeds, however, always a good idea, because we love definitions so much, that we talk about definitions a little more. I'm kind of like beating a drum here on purpose. You've seen this slide before, but I want it massaged into your brain. When you're thinking about definitions, this is exactly how you should think about definitions. I don't want to see no paltry definitions that are not amenable to this kind of analysis. You give me a definition, I'm immediately going to go, if the first part's true, is the second part true? If the second part's true, is the first part true? And if I get a no in either one of those, I'm going to send it back. This is exactly the sort of strategy that you should be employing whenever you're evaluating, creating, coming in contact with definitions. That's just what definitions are. We're highlighting clarity and rigor. So more can be said than I have said previously, though. So far, again, this is all old hat. You've seen these. Featherless biped, bad example. Famously bad definition. But I'll add some more content to these discussions. So not all definitions that pass that back and forth test are good definitions. Sometimes you'll hear that back and forth test described as like necessary and sufficient conditions. I may slip into that language just here and there, but that just means like if the first part's true, is the second part true? The second part's true, is the first part true? That's all that means. Just some jargon people use. But even so, if you can have definitions that satisfy such a criterion, and they might not be good definitions nonetheless. So, for example, Alan Ruttenberg, who's a friend of mine, you could define him as a human being who had $1 in his pocket on a September afternoon. It's a bad definition. It may be necessary and sufficient. It may work, right? But still, not a good definition. Not all definitions that pass such tests reflect the world is the thing. You could also define a squound as a round square. It's not a good definition. There's no such thing, right? But you can define whatever you want, right? Like that's the point. So you have to be on guard, right? We're trying to map the world. We're trying to accurately describe things in the world. So when we're creating necessary and sufficient conditions for definitions, that's our arbiter, right? We're looking out there. In addition, we typically try to avoid negative language when we're introducing definition. Why? I'm sure you've heard this before, but why? So here's some reasons. Definitions that have negative terms involved, they don't really provide an implicit or explicit endpoint in your defining. Observe, witness. I could define this water bottle, which is green, but instead of saying that, I could say something like, it is not blue, not specific shades of blue, not red. It is not cylindrical, or it is not round. It is not it's not smaller than my hand. I could say all sorts of things. Where do I stop? I'll tell you where I stop, by saying it's green and cylindrical and it's a water bottle. All positive things. Positive things. Those provide stopping points, explicit stopping points. If you're just defining things negatively, you can go on and on and on and on forever. Which maybe sometimes you have to. And you'll see an example in a minute when I close out this little portion. There are examples or cases where it's okay to do that sort of negative use or negative defining, but it's okay just in those cases where there is an implicit endpoint. Before I get there, so defining things negatively often obscures rather than illuminates. Just as I I was pointing out that there's no endpoint here when you're defining things negatively. These things are such definitions really kind of obscure what you're trying to say. So if I define a cat as not a dog, it doesn't really say much about cats. If Anselm defines God as that for which none greater can be conceived, doesn't really tell us anything about God. In fact, this is one of my favorite examples. If you're familiar with Anselm's argument, ontological argument for the existence of God, where he seems to conclude that God exists insofar as God is something none greater which can be conceived, you can even grant the conclusion and be like, still not the God I'm talking about, because I have no idea what God you're talking about, right? It's sort of the nature of the argument. Epicurus defined death as the absence of sensation. Cool. Great. Sure wish I knew more. Not that he can be, charged with for not telling us more. We don't have that kind of science yet. Nevertheless, you see what I'm saying? It kind of obscures. It's like a bit of I think of it as a little lazy. Also, humans struggle to reason with negation. We are bad at this, just bad. You ever seen these puzzles on the island, knights and knaves? On an island of knights and knaves, everybody is one or the other. Knights tell the truth and knaves always lie. You know these puzzles? You don't know these? Some of you saying yes, some of you saying no. Check it. You have encountered a group of islanders and want to know who is a knave and who's a knight. The islanders have made some statements about each other. Each statement should be taken independently. Each is either true or false. You have met a group of 3 islanders. Their names are Quentin, Vincent, and Zorro. When Vincent says Zorro never lies. Vincent says Quentin never lies. Zorro says Quentin is my type. I mean, Quentin is of the type that I am, which is how that should have been worded. Or it could have been both. I don't know who Zorro is. In fact, I don't know much about Zorro because he's basically only being described negatively. He just never lies. Anyway, what's the answer? It's not obvious. You have to work it out. And you probably make a mistake because reasoning with negation is not easy. I'm not going to let you do it. Some of your eyes just started glazing over. What I'm saying, though, this leads right into one of the other costs of negative language and definitions. They imply incorrect bifurcation of classes. We do have a difficult time reasoning with negation. One of the things we do cognitively is we try to simplify reasoning with negation by putting in implicit bifurcations or misunderstanding, or put another way, misunderstanding how negation reads. Let me show you. This is from, there was a paper, a famous, I think infamous paper at this point by Gary Merrill, attacking Barry Smith and his use of ontologies and Werner Cloisters. He seemed to suggest in the paper that Barry and Werner were committed to defining things like this: non-smoker, an entity that does not smoke. And Barry, a consequence of this would be things like lamps and colors and ideas are all non-smokers, which is absurd, right? Barry and Werner pointed out, of course, that the complement of a class is not necessarily a class. It's just the complement being the opposite of a smoker. It doesn't need to be a smoker or anything. But the confusion seemed to be that Gary had conflated internal and external negation. So external negation bifurcates all logical space, i.e., or e.g., entities that does not smoke, lamps and ideas. Internal negation bifurcates logical space within a class, like a person who does not smoke, which is usually what we mean when we say non-smoker. They're a person. Internal negation, right? It's easy to make this mistake, especially if you're thinking about negation. Negating things and reasoning through negations is hard. Now, I said, though, that there's at least one case in which it's okay to bifurcate or to think about negation in just this way. It's a case in which you have an implicit stopping point. You are bifurcating within those bounds and not confusing internal and external negation. And even though it is not as clear as it could be, or unobscure or inobscure, whatever the privative is, it's still somewhat clarifying because of its contrast. And what do I have in mind? Immaterial entity. In BFO, material entity, those are independent continuants that have material as parts. Immaterial entities are independent continuants which don't have material as parts. Huh? It's disjoint from material entity then. You know what a material entity is. And you know it's an independent continuant, right? Then you know they're both independent continuants. So you're talking about internal negation. It's disjoint from this other sibling class. And so you get some stopping point. These things are one or the other. Material or not. Does that make sense? So you have some stopping point. There's a little bit of there's clarity built in, even though there's negation.
So I assume that any negative definition like this is actually going to start with another positive definition that you are kind of defining against.
I think so. I think anyone that's gonna like avoid those issues that I was pointing to is gonna have that.
Right.
There's gonna be some kind of closure over the pair. It's gonna have to bifurcate internally in that way. Or it's going to run into these obscuring, no explicit or implicit stopping point, etc. Does that make sense? Any questions?
So I don't know, could you clarify a bit on where the stopping point is decided? Like with this example, it makes sense if I wanted to have a cropless field defined as opposed to a field with crops, but I don't know. I can't imagine a stopping point if you need to give a definition for something like the number 0 or something. And I could see that being useful in a lot of ways.
Could you say what you're saying again in a different way so that I can understand?
How do you know when the stopping point is? What it should
For
be?
defining 0?
Or just things that seem like they would have to have negation in the definition.
So in this case, which immaterial entity for sure, the sort of thing that seems like I can't think of a way to define it without involving negation. The way to do that is you have to think about how you would close off the space that's relevant. In this case, the space that would be relevant is independent continuance. So you're already doing that internal negation stuff. So you're talking about with respect to a class, just like with a smoke or non-smoker, right? You're thinking persons. Right, so you're already in that kind of refined space. And now you need to think of when you're in that, what are the conditions under which you could have something of a disjoint union, like you're exhausting everything under that parent class in one or more class, or under the scope with one or more classes that are disjoint from one another. So if you started with a material entity, so you got a positive definition, these things have materials parts. You say, okay, now I want to talk about everything else that's under independent continuant. Now at least you've restricted your scope to all the other independent continuant stuff, right? And so you can make this kind of clean divorce between the material things and the immaterial things. If you wanted to do that, you could do that with smokers and non-smokers too. You could say they're smokers, internal, they're people, so you're already in the class of people. So smokers, these are the people who smoke. And now I want to talk about non-smokers. Who are they? They're all the other people who don't smoke, right? So put your internal and you've got like a bifurcation of the appropriate class. And that can be illuminating, right? Maybe you do want to track information about non-smokers. You see this with bachelors, non-bachelors. It's like a famous analytic definition to these, right? Now, this is not to say there aren't tricky cases. There'll be tricky cases throughout. I'll give you an example just if I'm thinking about bachelors and non-bachelors. Is the Pope a bachelor? Seems a little different from saying is a plant a bachelor, right? So we're talking about people, yeah, the internal negation. So I can get rid of some of those bad cases, some of those problematic cases. But it's not clear to me that the Pope is a bachelor, right? But according to a definition that bifurcated the class, like of people into bachelor or males or male identifying individuals as bachelors or non-bachelors, Pope would count. Tricky cases, worth thinking about. But does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like that, the general structure though is carve out the space and then draw a line in the middle of it.
So when we're talking about negatively defined terms, are we talking about like
like the term itself has some sort of like morphological negation, not just the definition. Because I'm thinking of like say you had like sister defined.
Mm-hmm.
Could you then define brother as a sibling that is not a sister?
You could try.
That's what I'm saying,
But so-
does it require that the
Yeah.
term itself is like a not like non this or
Yeah, it can come up in all sorts of ways, right? It doesn't have to be in the label. Definitely, if for this to be on your radar, though, it has to be in the definition.
Okay.
So if you have negative terms in a definition, it's not to say that you can't, include them. It's just you should be wary about including negative terms in a definition. But you could define, there are negative terms that don't have nots or na or ne in their label themselves.
seems like those would just become like inferences and you need to define.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. What is J.L. Austin once famously was giving a talk, and he said there's no expression in English where you like, there's no positive expression in English that you can repeat multiple times that is the opposite of like a positivity. And he was contrasting this with no. He's like, you say no, it means it's a good thing, it's a positive thing. You say no, it's no, negative. No, positive. And somebody in the audience went, yeah. Anyway, sorry.
So maybe this is related to definitions,
Mhm.
because in Professionals class we're talking about them.
Great.
And the question I have is, what kind of definition are we aiming at? In the sense of, like, we were going over operational, nominal, demonstrative, stipulative, et cetera. It seems kind of like we want almost a nominal definition, in the sense that we're aiming for what the domain experts say a definition is.
Mhm.
And we're kind of working backwards from what the domain experts say.
That's right. Yeah.
So
I would say all of them. We tend to use all of them at varying points of our development cycle. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, our definitions, we refine them over time, right? Like, and sometimes we draw out new definitions from old definitions. They're often changed and updated. This is a work in progress, right?
I see.
So it's hard for me to say in any given point of our procedures what type. I know what we're trying to do is reflect the current scientific and research expertise that we encounter as accurately as possible.
Right.
Mhm. And in doing so, we're trying to reflect the world. And that can change because, I'm not a subject matter expert in like virology. So if their science changes, so do my definitions. Which is also incidentally, as a rule of thumb, why I don't weigh into contentious defining. So some people who shall remain nameless, Cobb, in a discussion over this past weekend, they were like, we're going to define viruses as alive. And I was like, there's a whole bunch of literature saying that they are not. It is a contentious issue. In fact, I have published a paper on this. And they're like, yeah, but we're going to do it. You're going to define in Cobb that viruses are alive. We're going to commit ourselves to that. I'm like, that's fine. You can do that. My tactic was to create a virus class that didn't mention life at all, because I don't know which way it's going to go. And I can do that without delving into living.
And that's so that when the science changes or decides or whatever, then it can just be more easily rolled in.
I can update. I could specialize, right? Like, doesn't matter. Like, I'm not committing myself one way or the other because and also it didn't matter. I didn't need to.
Right.
Even if they do decide they're alive, it won't matter. My definition is good anyway. I suspect I won't have to change it. Nothing about life seems to matter. Quote. All right, let me ask you to do something for a moment. Define these terms. You got, hit me. Who's got a definition for armed forces? Group in possession of weaponry. What else? Anybody else? Armed forces.
Let's have a subclass of the military that has weapons.
Subclass of the military that has weapons. All right. What else? No?
So not armed force, but armed forces, I would say, is sum total of all military forces that a nation has at their disposal.
Sum total of all military forces a nation has is three different definitions. Somewhat similar in varying respects, but also not. How about military? What's the military? Yeah. An armed force. Oh. Got it. So you're saying armed force is a subclass of military. You're saying military is a subclass of armed force. Okay.
I was gonna say, military is an organization of people with intentions to attack for or defend their country.
All right. Matthew, what you got?
I was basically gonna go with a group of weapons that is tied to a political body of some sort and used for militaristic purposes, but I wasn't sure what that
Wow,
was.
circular.
I know.
And also it's a group of weapons.
Group of entities.
Oh, I thought you said a weapon.
No.
It's like, yeah, when I drive around in the south and I see guns, like I see the military. Yeah. You have one?
Mine was pretty similar. to this.
Awesome. Okay. Wildly different in some ways, somewhat similar. This is common. What have I said, right? Ontology engineering can be divided, at least methodology in a high level, between conceptualist and realist approaches. And why do I make this point? Well, I mean, here's where it's from, that conceptualization from Gruber. People tend to think sometimes when they're doing ontology engineering in terms of concept modeling rather than real world modeling. We do realism. We want to focus on the way the world is rather than just the words. Why? You just saw why. Imagine you come to a room and you ask such a question to a group of individuals and say, hey, what do you think an armed force is? What do you think the military is? Define your terms. And then they all give out different answers. What would the conversation look like next? You would be arguing about whether your concept was the right concept. You would be fighting about which words to use. We do not want to do that. I don't care what words you use. I care about the structure. I care about the world. I care about the basic logic underpinning what you're saying. I would look at these definitions and try to find what's common through them and define that rigorously so that I could characterize all of your uses with some single baseline logic. And I can do that. And that's the emphasis on the real world. The real world, realism here is not some like heavy duty metaphysical sense of realism. It's just that there's a common logic. That's what I mean by the world, the base logic. That's it. And logic doesn't care about your words, but it can describe them. Does that make sense? Again, massaging this info into your brains. I want you to keep this in mind. I'll hit it many, many times. And now, what you've all been waiting for, modern warfare. Recall classical warfare from the very start, the Battle of Cannae, Second Punic War. Romans pushed through the center of Hannibal's troops with the goal of splitting his army, and Hannibal encircled them. Devastating loss for the Romans, which they somehow recovered from. Classic warfare. Early modern warfare, characterized by the widespread use of gunpowder, explosive, and professional armies. Professional armies, like paid troops, standing armies, right? Not just like, uh-oh, war's broken out. We better go get some mercenaries and people who are of a certain fighting age, but people who are actually trained, drilling. This is what they do basically for a living. That's professional army. Greater reliance on strategy and intelligence and a massive increase in the number of deaths. Modern warfare, characterized by weapons of mass destruction and stealth and massive coordination of a significant number of resources, expansion of routine operational environments to include land, sea, and air, as well as digital domains that stress across participating nations. It's bigger scope. Everything's bigger. It's like Texas. Everything just got bigger and bigger and bigger. You can see massive invasions occurring. Up at the top, you see D-Day. Over here, you see invasion of Iraq. Modern warfare. This is just an illustration when you're thinking about some of the scope of modern warfare. This is an electromagnetic warfare domain and required coordination during engagements. Look at all this. Space, air, cyber, maritime, land, synchronized, coordinated efforts. Traditional warfare focused on kinetic attacks and defenses. Physical damage to people and infrastructure. Modern warfare shifts towards non-kinetic attacks and defenses, towards digital and cyber. As you can see, commercial communications, foreign media, airborne sensors, infrastructure, of course, that's all through there. But there's a bigger emphasis on some of these, maybe the media aspect, for example, the cyber aspect, everything, the electrical grids and the circuitry that underpins these sorts of things. It's frightening. It's a little frightening. Significant cyber incidents since 2006. They've gone up and up and up and up. Better illustration. Significant cyber attacks, in this case, means hacks into a country's government agencies, defense and high-tech companies, or crimes with losses of more than $1 million. Canada and the US, 156. Here's an example. In May 2020, the NSA discovered that Russian hackers were stealing sensitive data from American organizations through a bug in a popular email server. They found it, they rooted it out, started exploiting it. 2018, worst year for cyber attacks in America with 30 incidents in that year alone. Russia's got 8, UK's got 47. I mean, in December 2020, one of the biggest media organizations in Germany fell victim to a ransomware attack. 6,000 computers were infected, halted work on its servers. Do you know what a ransomware attack is? It's where your computer gets locked down and you have to call human resource. What is it? They have to call their hotline, and they're like, they're very nice to you, and they're like, yeah, we can unlock your computer, but you have to give us $1 million. And they're very nice and pleasant about it. Basically, they're going to delete everything you have on your system unless you give them a certain amount of money. 2020, malware was used to commit cyber attacks against 9 Indian human rights activists. Their keystrokes were logged, audio recorded, and personal credentials stolen. Happens all over the place. Yeah. Modern warfare. How did we get here, though? How did we get here? How do we get to a place where you could actually do that sort of activity? What I just described requires a considerable amount of coordination. You have to really be able to work with people and information at scale to pull off that sort of attacks that you just saw, the sort of like modern conflict that goes on. I mean, D-Day was massive, right? But like war in Iraq was too. And all sorts of conflicts that go on across the globe right now have that sort of magnitude. It's sometimes said that the US military is able to put boots on the ground in full show of force in like 48 hours, like a full-on assault team in 48 hours. And it's one of the reasons why the US military is considered so frightening, because they can be in your back door in 48 hours. That is unprecedented in the history of warfare. That's insane. How do we get here? Regulation for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States way back in the day. Compiled by this baron in the Inspector General of the Continental Army in 1779. It was codifying strategies for joint military efforts during engagement. I'm not sure if that's what he looked like, but in my headcanon it is. Actually, this document, this order of discipline, order and discipline, published in 1779. Later, people came, it was such a popular document that people came and created illustrations for it. And what you're looking at is somebody who came later and illustrated it. Among things discussed in these orders and regulations were things like the doctrine of massing fires. Problem, how do you coordinate a bunch of soldiers in a continental army who were trying to fight off the British because of tea, I guess? How do you get them to this ragtag group of individuals who probably haven't had a lot of military training until Lafayette gets here and starts teaching them how the French do it? Before that, though, how do you get them to coordinate, say, massing fires, that is to say, all firing in the same location at a given time without killing each other? How do you do that? Coordinated dispersal of artillery on a single target. The doctrine of massing fires, it's in this document. Like, this is how you do it. He gives a step-by-step procedure, a workflow, a walkthrough. It requires real-time coordination, requires common operational view of what's going on, and interoperable artillery. And it's achieved by new information supporting strategies and governments around troops, as well as new training for troops. You got to know how to do it. You have to have the right information to pull it off. Massing fires was a strategy that could be realized by militaries long before Steuben codified this doctrine in 1779. The actual doctrine for massing fires was only approved in the US as what to do in 1939. There was a long period where people were doing this anyway, before and after. But the codification enabled progressive refinement of the military capability over time. It was aided by professionalization of armed forces, including signals indicated who can be trusted in battle, training, etc. What do I mean by that? Well, look, in professional militaries, in the professionalization of militaries, you have as a goal the training, credentialing, evaluating, continuous re-engineering to create habits aimed towards pre-coordination of intermesh plans at different levels, so soldiers will coordinate spontaneously when executing the sorts of actions for which they've been trained. That's kind of the point of professionalization. You want soldiers to be able to move on a dime based on their habits. You want to drill so that they just know how to react, much like an expert tennis player doesn't think about swinging a racket, they just do it. You want soldiers that can just do what they need to do in the heat of the battle with little instruction, because you don't have time to instruct. Again, massive difference from back in the day. A lot more coordination. Soldiers are like kings of royalty, used to get on the battlefield and be like, go, do this and do that. Their lieutenants and right lieutenants would go off and tell other soldiers like in the real time. And here you don't have that kind of time. Here's a professional certification process. Member of the Army profession, volunteer entering. They have an aspiration to be a professional. They get certification. They progress through other certifications, and then they end their official service by retiring as a veteran. But they often go through a lot of certification. They get credentialing. Why? What's the point? In the military, they do get a lot of credentials. You get a lot, like it's a signal though. Much like it is out in the real world, right? Or not the real world, they're all the real world, but out in like more academic space where you get a credential like doctor or something. You're signaling something to the broader community. Here too, signaling something to your comrades that you can be listened to, that you know what to do. There are ranks, credentials through which soldiers may be promoted that provide trustworthy standards for vetting experience and knowledge, which in turn creates new strategic and operational team arrangements and activities. You can look at some of this in Shane Babcock's military rank ontologies, a friend of mine who's been working on some of this, just codifying this. But look, think about it. It should be a little obvious. If you're in the heat of the battle and you need to make a decision and you're unsure what to do, but somebody's yelling commands at you, hopefully they'll have a rank that you can see very clearly so you can know immediately whether to trust them or how to trust them or not. You want to be able to see something so you can react quickly. You want to be able to know that they're the person you should listen to. And if you know anything about military history, you'll also know that even though it's against many conventions, sometimes, not uncommon, in the heat of battle, adversarial forces will don the garbs and the ranks of their opponents to confuse them. Yeah, pick up a colonel lapel or something and be like, go do this. You just confuse the army, right? Like, why? Because in the heat of battle, what are you doing? You're trusting what you see, you're trusting what you hear, and you're trusting your training. But that's what it's for, right? It helps create more functionality, moving faster, coordinated, standard efforts. Does that make sense? Of course it does. All within the scope of these epistemic communities. Remember what those are. They have standards. They have standards against which they like operate, drilling, training, and rank. Massing fires is not just something that happened in 1779 or the need for it. I mean, anticipating, how do we anticipate is a thing. Massing intelligence fires now. We should be able to do that, right? 9/11 illustrated challenges of predicting such things out of intelligence failures. We want to get ahead of this. We want to be able to like not just mask the fires ourselves, but also react or anticipate when massing fires might be coming our way. But prediction requires real-time information sharing and revising, a common operational perspective, interoperability across activities. Hopefully this sounds familiar to what I was saying just a minute ago. It's almost verbatim what I was discussing when I mentioned massing fires. It also requires new information to support strategies, semantic interoperability, and new governments and trainings, both for humans and machines. It's not that much different, is what I'm saying. Predicting these sorts of fires and not that much different from amassing them to begin with. It's just now we're focused less on the body count and the kinetic or kinetic picture, but also the non-kinetic picture, the information and machines, the bigger scope. Agencies need signals to understand who can be trusted. This is what I was talking about. U.S. government agencies, as you see over here, concerned with intelligence activities, either in oversight, managerial support, or participatory roles. These are various organizations that handle intelligence in the U.S. The intelligence community is an epistemic community. They have normative beliefs about the purpose, beliefs based on investigating problems in their domain, standards for accuracy and analysis, and a common community set of goals operating under the president. Predicting these massing intelligence failures or fires also requires common operational perspective. Here's an example. Joint Intelligence Doctrine, 2019 or 2013, updated from the previous lecture. Here's the DoD definition of interoperability. Incidentally, this joint doctrine I was just pointing to pulls a lot of its definitions from the DoD dictionary, the Department of Defense dictionary. So I'm pulling it from there as well. The Department of Defense definition of interoperability. Ability of services, of systems, units, or forces to provide data, information, material, services to and accept from the same from other systems, units, or forces, and to use the data, information, material, and services exchanged to enable them to operate effectively together. Not semantic interoperability, but not too dissimilar from it, right? Something nearby. I think we're talking about something similar. This kind of just points to, I think, the need for this interoperability. I mean, it points to also need for standardization. You're not going to get interoperability without standardization. And the military is a great example of an organization, at least the U.S. military. It's a great example of an organization that really sticks closely to standardization because they have to create an operational picture that is interoperable across groups. You have activity interoperability involves enforced prescription of internal requirements. What sorts of words do you use in the battlefield? What sorts of operations do you conduct? What can you conduct? What's relevant to you standardly? Army doctrine publications, references, field manuals, and technical pubs are often required reading for at least people who are organizing troops. And these provide that kind of interoperable picture. At least the hope is that they provide that kind of interoperable picture. Standardization is crucial to this. Governs the analytic processes used by joint intelligence organizations to produce intelligence estimates and other intelligence products in support of the joint forces commanders' decision-making processes. That's what this joint intelligence preparation of the operational environment publication is for. Putting it another way, if you have different agencies with different forces or different abilities or capabilities in the field and they need to work together, you sure as hell want them to be using similar language. You surely want them to be doing similar things. You don't want a case where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So how do we do that? Drill, 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 baby. It's like an oil baron. Drill, drill, drill. Got to make sure that they don't even think to think differently in some sense. They have the same terms in mind because that's what they've been trained to think, or that's how they've been trained to think. And you don't want to leave it a chance because people could die. Does that make sense? So standardization is crucial. And it's a lot of it. Joint doctrine. This joint doctrine is what governs these sorts of interactions across agencies in times of need. And it's a lot. Some of them you can see, some of them you can't. Some of them are classified, some of them are open. You can go public, poke around, you'll find some stuff. It's pretty interesting. They have a lot of definitions in there. In these documents, they also have a lot of like operational, what we can think of as like design patterns for what to do in various circumstances. Born out of the test of experience and time, drilled into the heads of their soldiers and leadership. Like this, Joint Intelligence 2. This provides an authoritative body of consistent statements on how military forces conduct joint operations and how militaries or plans are to be constructed. Guidance. Also a common lexicon which must be used by military planners and leaders, which will be what those charged with execution of military plans will anticipate and understand. Again, human interoperability, right? Making sure we're talking about the same thing in the same way. Unfortunately, it ain't that good. It's for humans, yeah. Not necessarily consistent. We've seen some of this. I told you, though, this comes out of the DoD dictionary. So a lot of these joint publication definitions emerge from the DoD dictionary of military in terms. This is, as of November 2021, this is a definition, for example, of intelligence, which we've seen. Also, joint intelligence is defined there, right? These joint publications need to be joining. So they have a need for joint intelligence. So there's a definition for this as well. I don't really take issue with the joint intelligence definition. I do take issue with the intelligence definition as we've seen. So this is old hat. They include activities within the scope. But I don't think intelligence is exactly equal to intelligence gathering activities. I think it's important to separate those, even though groups do use the word intelligence that way. Absolutely. Totally concede. Ontologically, though, there's a difference. You can use the words you use. I want to map the structure. That's not intelligence in this sense. Also, organizations engaged in such activities are considered to be intelligence. CIA, I think, is not itself intelligence. It gathers it, so there's a difference. That aside, it's clearly specific to military intelligence, and so, as I pointed out, wouldn't be able to serve as a common parent to a lot of other focus or a lot of other definitions of intelligence. That's okay. That makes sense. This is the DoD dictionary, right? Of course, it's specific to that. Still, just to highlight that point, focus on foreign nations, hostile or potentially hostile forces of elements or areas of potential or actual operations. Counter examples, if you're thinking about this from a broader perspective, include things like the police gather intelligence. That would be excluded from this definition. So, activity does, like these predicting massing information failures and fires, it does require joint activity, joint coordination across groups. It involves enforceable prescriptions, things you can say, do this, train this way. Unfortunately, I don't think it particularly provides a precise guidance, that is, for interoperability across activities. This is not to say that I don't think this document isn't very valuable. Of course, it's very valuable. And of course, it stood the test of time. They continue standing the test of time. And we are, as I've said, quite frightening when putting boots on the ground. They're doing something right. What I'm pointing to is the future, right? We can always be better. And even though I'm saying, and I've said here, I'll say it a million times, let them use the words they want to use. I'm also kind of not talking about them when I'm talking about improvements. I'm not talking about the soldiers who are telling other soldiers what to do. I'm talking about how and to the extent to which they can trust machines to help them do this, because that's what we're interested in. Machine support, trusting in AI. And for that, because computers are dumb, we have to be much more precise. Yeah.
Topic here, but is that necessarily a good thing? Because
No, not necessarily, no.
with like modern warfare, it's kind of concerning that we're taking out a lot of human aspects. I think it's gonna make it progressive.
What was the question? The question was, is this necessarily a good thing that we're trying to shift our reliance onto more machines and trust the machines?
Well, I
So-
think we have to.
I think we do too, but like to quickly
You look at drones. You just look at drones. we don't have the thousands of individual pilots to pilot each drone.
Mm-hmm.
Just don't, right? So
That's right. That's right. But to answer like to two sides of the question, to answer your question, you said is it necessarily a good thing? Absolutely not. Nothing we do is necessarily a good thing, no. And you can see some real cause for alarm here for many reasons. You can see cause for alarm in terms of like malfunctioning, like should we actually trust these things, right? Should we? Like, do we have enough confidence in distributed systems to now to manage drone strikes of that kind of like order? Maybe, maybe not. What's good though, what's good about what we do, and so far as it might go some way to answer that question, is because our focus is on more of a symbolic representation and proof-oriented representation, we have a better handle on explainability when we're talking about these sorts of systems. I can tell you why certain outputs come out of systems in a step-by-step proof-wise procedure. This is not exactly the case for most other AI strategies that are more statistical in nature and black boxy. So it's hard to trust a black box. Easier to trust like a proof that's generated from protege for why the murderer was Barry. You know what I mean? Because I can see it. I can see all the steps, and that's what we try to make precise. And if we scale that to the level of thousands of drones,
I mean, I think one of the problems is that the world has become more complicated and it's not as simple anymore. And there's just too much that humans can do. Like, I'll give you a good example, and this is totally unclassed, but if you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, right, and we're tracking intercontinental ICBMs, right? Only intercontinental ICBMs typically had the ability to have their afterburners look like an ICBM, right? There weren't a lot of, yeah, there were the SR-71s and stuff, but now the problem is that we can have certain things that burn hot enough to look like an ICBM. We also have every single time a G5 puts on its afterburners, basically, it can look like an ICBM. So all of a sudden, instead of now having manual tracking by a human being looking at computer screens that are tracking these things, now all of a sudden they're not just trying to track 6 or 7 signatures at once. There might be 10,000 signatures going on instantaneously at the same time. So there's just not enough manpower to do certain things, and so we need to have automation and machines do them.
that's right.
But to her point, right?
Right.
But to her point, there is a liability when depending on the machines, right?
Mhm.
Because all it takes is for somebody to poison the model,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
and your output either lulls you into not taking action or forces you to take action because you believe you're under attack.
Yeah. I mean, just look at LLMs and RAG, right? We know that LLMs will hallucinate. Businesses are like, okay, they hallucinate 25% of the time. We can handle that. In the intelligence community, you can't tolerate that because that hallucination might be like, hey, you should bomb this building, and then instead you bombed a nursery school.
I agree. And just give one more case. Like if I'm using a Q&A system based on generative AI, and I ask whether to give my daughter a certain amount of Tylenol, 80% accuracy is great. Not in that case.
Yeah.
I want to know exactly why I'm supposed to give her Tylenol. I don't want just some statistical output. Similarly over here. And that's what I'm pointing to when I talk about like our focus on symbolic representation not as opposed to as a supplement to statistical information. Because with symbolic representations, ontological representations, we can explain why the answer is there. And maybe you disagree with the premises, in which case more work needs to be done, but at least now you have the premises to disagree with. And that's not the case when you're looking at, say, the generative AI model. What are you going to do? Ask it again? Like, it's not going to be helpful, right? And so when we're looking at, what we're aiming towards is a sort of human machine teaming trust balance that you see with calculators, right? Like that's the gold standard. We trust calculators. We trust them all the time, right? We trust a lot of code. We trust certain simple code. We trust a lot of things in our environment. What we're aiming towards is trying to make the AI stack that we have now get closer and closer to that so we can offload some of what we do. Of course, there's always a concern that we're lulled into like complacency. So we need to be on guard about that. I feel better about that kind of complacency if I can see a step-by-step proof providing justification for why a certain decision was made, which is exactly what you have with a calculator. I know exactly why the output is delivered. I
We,
can
we
model
can
it.
talk about the philosophy behind whether or not these things are good or bad all day long, but the fact of the matter is they exist. So
Yeah.
what we want to do now is we want to make them the best they can. You know, Gary Kasparov, back in the early 2000s, he's like the greatest chess player, you know, in the world, and he lost to Deep Blue, IBM's Deep Blue. And it was like it rocked him to his core. So he spent the next 10 years thinking, how can I beat Deep Blue? And so they developed this man and machine algorithm, kind of like what John is talking about, where like he wasn't just going to let Deep Blue play chess, but he was going to play chess with something like Deep Blue. And then they tested it in chess. Then they tested it against Go, which is like way more complicated than
Yeah.
chess. And then they were able to win Go games. And then they went back and they played Deep Blue and they beat it 10 times in a row. They just annihilated Deep Blue because Gary was able to use the computer with his knowledge and the computer's knowledge. And it was just unstoppable. I think that's what we're trying to get to. But yeah, I mean, we can have the philosophical question of like whether or not it's good for everyone to have a cell phone. Well, the fact of the matter is everyone has a cell phone. So we have to live in a world where everyone has a cell phone. And I think this,
I don't even think we got to that question. I think we were more like in the how do you trust machines question, right?
Yeah.
I don't even think we got into like the ethics of, which is the other side for sure, like whether we should, but like Jay's right, like whether we should or not, it's there, right? We have to deal with that and the ramifications. We didn't spend enough time thinking about whether we should. We were more interested in whether we could, and so we're already there, right?
Yeah.
And it's true of technology in general. So, but there are like ethical questions to think through. I think at this point, the questions to my mind become more about responsibility than ethics. So it's like, what do you do now?
Yeah.
But yeah, but all very relevant points. All right, back to interoperability across activities. Again, I don't want to just undermine the good work that's gone on in the development and use of these sorts of joint doctrines. I just want to highlight that if you're looking for a higher level of precision, which they are for sure, the groups using these are, this ain't going to get you there. And again, moving from the words to the world, it's not going to get us likely to the same place. If we work from the world to the words, it's more likely to get us on the same page. So I will point out this definition's more explicit than the definition that I'd given for intelligence, which I like. There's some explicitness that's important. And I just remind you, I discussed a planned act. Intelligence gathering is a planned act aimed at acquiring information to promote the interest of an individual or collective using methods deemed reliable by that individual or collective. Also, I'll go through this a little quickly because you've seen it before and we're running a bit low on time. But planned act, of course, this definition doesn't require the information, in fact, promotes relevant interests, just aimed at, need not even acquire intelligence or evidence based on this, but must be constrained by the interest of relevant parties. So it's kind of a little bit of flexibility. Broad enough to cover both individuals and groups, and could be specialized to reflect intelligence cycle planned acts of the sort we saw in the joint doctrine definition. I think that's a specialization of intelligence and intelligence gathering. So this would be something of a parent for that. Also, you can specialize in other ways by making it covert. Not all intelligence gathering is, but you can make it so. Relies on evidence, role borne by information content entity that when it justifies or undermines justification in one's beliefs. Of course, always want a caveat until it's not a caveat anymore. Not roles for information content entities not currently in BFO and CCO. Fingers crossed, 2024 is the year. Evidence is just information content entity on this characterization that bears such an evidence role. And intelligence then is just the output of intelligence gathering. There were some concerns about the use of calling this intelligence gathering if it doesn't have to result in intelligence. I've not yet convinced myself that you are right, but points taken. I'm still pondering over it here. I'm just, again, reminding you of the back and forth, the like sort of deliberation you can go through when you're thinking about more specific definitions of intelligence of the sort that you would see in a joint doctrine and maybe broader definitions. Like there are differences between what I have written and what they wrote. I've separated out gathering from intelligence. I've separated evidence roles. All of that was kind of buried in their definitions, and that's fine for their purposes for sure. We want to be a little more specific, a little more precise. I would give you this, but I won't. I will just come back to this. Why? Why more specific again? We're aiming for machines. Joint publication definition guide is provided for you. When you're creating definitions, according to the joint publication standards, there are some criteria. The definitions should not be overly restrictive. They should not be circular. They should be positive, and they should have no hidden definitions. That seems reasonable. In fact, at the beginning of this lecture, we talked about at least two of these. They should be positive, right? Not negative, right? No hidden definitions. Don't make them obscure, right? Necessary and sufficient conditions. Here's some definitions here from joint publications: operational area, contingency operations, subordinate command. I'll let you look at these for just a second and think about them for just a second, especially in light of the definition or guidance given over on your left-hand side. Let me put that another way. Do these definitions satisfy the guidance?
No,
They do not. They do not, as a matter of fact, satisfy the
welcome
guidance.
to my world.
Yeah. Welcome to change the world. Now, this is true, right? Even by their own guidance, they fail. Of course, I don't want to knock joint doctrine too much. Go look at ontologies. Out in the wild, it's not like they're all genus species. It's not like they don't use negative definitions. These things happen, right? For sure. And the folks who are putting this together were no doubt trying to align by this guidance, or for whatever reason they didn't. So this is not a knock on them. Definition construction is hard, but also calls to our attention, right? This is something that can be improved. Right here you see, just highlight overarching term. I've got this one marked as unclear, not concise, and has including a hidden definition. An operational area is an overarching term. Okay.
This is one of the things that Tim and I have had to do, where we start trying to explain one thing, and then all of a sudden inside of the definition, there's three other terms that we're like, no one's going to know what these are. Oh, we need to make classes for those things. And then all of a sudden it just explodes.
Yeah, I mean, this is example. It's an overarching term, which is to say it has a lot of hidden definitions, right? It encompasses more descriptive terms. Cool. Like right off the bat. I'll let you go through some of these on your own time. Again, just highlighting. If I'm in the room, already there's a reason they want the kind of clarity. They want the kind of, oftentimes they want me to be a bit of a bull in a china shop, right? To break deadlock and to provide like another perspective. And so I'll say at the outset, when I walk into rooms like this, I have a different kind of flavor around me, and I'm expected to. So, but I do exactly what we do in class. Like I would listen, somebody would write, this happens not infrequently. Somebody writes their definition on the board and then everybody starts playing jazz on it. I usually will let that happen for a little bit. And then at some point, somebody will either ask me or I'll just chime in because I've got bored and I'm tired of playing on my phone. And I'll be like, that's all mashed potatoes. I usually say that because it's a little disarming, but also true. And it takes people a little aback, I found, because I'm so direct about it. I'm like, this is all mashed potatoes. Let me untease the web. And so then I start doing what we've been doing in class. What I was just doing a minute ago with a joint doctrine and definition of intelligence, and then the preliminary one, at least that I was describing. I start teasing out aspects of the definition. I start creating parent definitions. I start extrapolating or extracting the broader structure so that everybody can have a piece of the puzzle that they want using whatever labels they want. And I say that again and again. I'm like, call it what you want. I'm curious about the structure, because the structure is the interesting part to me. That's the part I want to feed a machine, right? And so even saying like, that's the part I want to feed a machine, like even saying that to a group of people of this sort, it makes sense to them even though they're not machines, because what we end up doing is clarifying, separating intelligence from the activities and the agencies, intelligence gathering from activities and agencies is clarifying, intuitively clarifying. I don't have to make that much of a case. Although, of course, groups will say that's not how I use the word intelligence. I'll say you can use it however you want, but I'm talking about the structure. Is an agency a process? No, right? And they'll usually say, no, it's not. I see what you're doing, right? I see what you're saying. And it's that unteasing. But again, the strategy there, again, be a professor. Rule 1. Rule 2, get invited. Rule 3, just let them talk. And then rule 4, or like heuristic 4, just cut through the mashed potatoes. And that is honestly freaking valuable, right? It's a very valuable thing. This is why sometimes at APL, they would literally say, with no joking or facetiousness, call the philosopher to sort this out. I don't know. We're talking past each other. We need a philosopher to come help us.
And you also need to know your use case, John, right?
Absolutely.
So like at APL, you guys did a lot of really cool stuff, and you had a lot of great data engineers that built you cool tools and graphs and stuff in order to use these ontologies. But if you're with a customer and they're just using it to tag data, then your definition really isn't that important. And where you placed it ontologically really isn't that important. But it becomes important if you mature your services and you want to future-proof it because you want to start doing really cool stuff.
That is absolutely right. And so Jay is highlighting another aspect of this. So you do want to speak to the customer or the stakeholder. And so I wouldn't go through the details in most circumstances of like the differences between processes and boundaries or something like that. Like they don't care if they're just tagging data. I can still provide some future proofing structure for them that makes intuitive sense. And I always keep in mind, how would this look in a bigger architecture? And I'm guided by that. I'm not a genius. I'm just guided by that, by other architectures that I use, like Common Core. I try to fit things in an existing framework that's already been vetted and filled out for a lot of circumstances. And so that really helps me. That's that bottom up, top down strategy, right? So that's where I get that future proofing perspective. And I don't have to tell them that. I don't often tell them that. I'll go a whole meeting without saying the word ontology. That's totally fine. But if anything, if I use any jargon out of this class in those sorts of meetings, I use the word logic because it's powerful and it's true. Just say, I'm just building a basic logic for you around the terms that you use that can describe all the terms that you use in a bigger structure. If you find yourself in an environment where you're setting up like ontologies and you're just doing tagging or something simple, you want to create an environment where you don't have to go do it again. Because let me tell you, if you do it wrong and you have to go back and do it, that is painful. If you have like embedded in your system some like deep structured ontology, and then you realize that, oh, up at the tippy top, we got to make a bunch of massive changes. Where do you think that complexity goes? Everywhere. This is one of the reasons why, incidentally, BFO is stable. It's not changing. It's good. If anything, we'll add stuff to it, not taking anything away, because it's 700 projects strong, right? Like changing anything in BFO has serious ramifications. That's why we're trying so hard to get clear on what's in CCO and what should be in CCO, recommended as CCO for 2.0, because we do not want it to change significantly after January.
Hey, John, back to your mashed potato example.
Yeah.
One of the things I think you want to highlight there is that you recentered the room's focus by reminding them that they're, going to be feeding it to a machine. It allows them to no longer own their word choice, and it allows them to give up sort of that ownership of the label war for the greater good without their egos being hurt. And really getting people's egos not to hurt and clash seems to be the biggest hurdle in a committee of consensus-driven decision-making.
Tim is absolutely right. One of the things I try to highlight in your training is that the technical side of this picture is not as challenging as the social side. You really do have to be on guard. Like, it is surprising and frustrating to me how how much hurt feelings get in the way of actual progress. It's a little surprising to me how little we've accomplished in the decades. I mean, it is at the same time impressive that we've accomplished as much as we have, but like I also see how the cake gets made behind closed doors. And I see how easily people can get upset and how much ownership they have. And I can see why people have ownerships over the words or want ownership over the words they use in their agencies. I get the interstitial conflicts. It is something that can be avoided. It's something that can be addressed, and like recentering the discussion so that it has less to do with their ego or less to do with like their senses of ownership is a very good strategy to make progress. I do it all the time, and that's something we should learn and focus on doing as well. I appreciate you calling attention to that, Tim. That's exactly right.
Yeah, sure. I mean, people have to explain it to their leaders, right? Their seniors. And if the senior reads the definition, says, this is gobbledygook, I don't understand it. You tell them like, hey, this is for machine readable capabilities. It's not just for human consumption. They go, oh, okay, I don't understand it. That's good enough for me.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I'll trust you. And that is sort of the point. Later in your training, for those of you who are in the program for the longer term, just to highlight this point a bit, I do insist that you work with people in safe spaces that are hard to work with. Some of you are in Slack. I insist on it because there are lots of sorts of people out in the world that you'll have to learn how to work around and work with. So it is part of the training, that social side. It's honestly at this stage probably more important than the technical side.
And it's a small community, and you don't want to get kicked off the island, you know?
That's right. That's
You want
right.
to be known as somebody who, when you got brought up in conversation, they're like, that guy's really difficult to work with.
Yeah, you do not want to be that person. You
Yeah.
don't, I call them a butt person.
Yeah.
The butt people. They're the people you say, somebody says something good about them and they go, but you don't want to be the butt person. Anyway,
I know for the young people, like this, we're talking about label wars, and it sounds so stupid, but it is the number, like we always say, like, it's not the technology constraints, it's the tribal constraints. And it's the fact that like you might go into an organization and the engineers all call it something, and then the system architects call it something else. And they're like, we've been calling this for 37 years. We've been calling it for 24 years. And it matters. I mean, there's a concept called the Harvard Revised Number, which is like a catalog for space objects. And it's called, one of the alternate labels is the Yale catalog of bright stars catalog, right? So think about it. Yale and Harvard probably argued for a long time over who gets the proper label for this thing,
Right.
because they both had it. So when you get into those, that's like where John's like talk about the political thing comes in. It's like, this shouldn't matter, but it matters to some people a lot, you know?
It certainly does. Let me wrap up in this last minute we have, and then I just want to highlight, what did we do? Okay, so definitions are important as usual. We discussed some aspects of definitions beyond their necessary and sufficient conditions that you should keep in mind, some caveats. Not all necessary and sufficient conditions are good. We want to match the good ones are the ones that match up to the world. They also don't include things like negatives if you can get away with it. But if you're going to use negative expressions, make sure it's in the context of like internal negation. There's a genuine complement class that you can define in terms of, namely, like the example you should keep in mind is a mnemonic is material versus immaterial entity. Okay, so that sort of structure is fine. We also discussed in the modern warfare, we dipped our toes a bit in modern warfare and its opposition, or at least how it's changed over time from classical and in early modern warfare, largely in size and scale and scope, covering not just kinetic behavior, kinetic impacts, but also non-kinetic, cyber, electromagnetic, all that sorts of domains are now within scope. And so a massive amount of information. How do you handle that sort of environment? How do you handle like modern warfare? How do you engage or field a group of people to engage in certain activities in this nature nowadays with all that information in that broader scope? Standardization and coordination is the thing. More and more standardization, more coordination, more drilling. Now we have gotten to a point where we have fairly decent, well described, I would say, definitions, common operating or perspectives. We have this sort of stuff right now. we're doing, I mean, we ain't bad at it, you know what I'm saying? Like the US, that is. There's all this doctrine publications you can read and see what the common operating pictures are often, and how folks talk to one another, how they're prescribed to talk to one another in these environments. We also have ranks. We have like structures and drilling and practice around the recognition of these things in the heat of battle and outside of it. All very important. We want to do better. Just like this example that you were pointing to when we were gesturing at, like, or at least from the conversation, what came out, like statistical AI versus like more secure, more explainable AI. Like we're aiming to that arena, right? We want trustworthy results, things that we can point to as a matter of proof, not just outputs that we may or may not be able to rely on. We want precision. And how do we do that? In our standardization, in our drilling, in our training, in our amassing and prediction of future intelligence fires. More of the symbolics, more of the ontology explanations. We want to build that stuff into our systems across agencies and across groups so that we can use machines and trust machines to give us appropriate outputs that can be validated, vetted, and ensure that what we're doing is in fact operating with a similar common picture or similar picture to those other agencies in the community, but also we can trust that we're doing so internally and externally. Now, how do we do that again? Modeling the world, basic logic, take that away, and we will pick up next time.